finest place on earth. But some folks don't appreciate this land that gave them birth. I hear that up in Washington they're having an awful fuss, 'cause communists and spies were making monkeys out of us. The bureaus and departments have been busy night and day. They're figuring out just how we gave our secrets all away. And Congress has appointed a committee, so they said, to find out who's American and who's a low-down red. They call them up to Washington to speak for Uncle Sam.
That is Lulu Bell and Scotty singing the 1952 hit, I'm No Communist. This was a song of the Red Scare, which was the purge of communists in America, whether they existed or not. Then we'll see the Hollywood blacklist, enemies within America, and then we'll see the junior senator from Wisconsin, followed by the trial of the Rosenbergs. The purge of American communists, whether they existed or not, fell under the purview of what was known as the DIES Committee, the House Un-American Activities Committee, or the WAC. Now, what was the WAC? In 1938, as the nation was approaching the Second World War, and many in the government knew it, in order to keep Nazi fifth columnists from undermining the security of the nation, conservative Texas Democrat Martin Dice was given the chairman of this standing committee of the House. And so, between 1945 and 1969, the House Un-American Activities Committee went after all supposed communists in the country. However, it is very important to understand something about what the WAC was really all about. Communism, Soviet communism, was really secondary to its overall mantra, its overall goal. What it was really doing was trying to undermine the New Deal as possible. Since the New Deal was in place, one of the ways that conservatives could go against the New Deal was to label it as communists. And because of this, and because of the actions of others within the government, many began to scramble for cover and align themselves on the side of right. For instance, Harry S. Truman passed Executive Order 9085, which was a federal employee loyalty program. This was designed to make sure that those that were coming into the government took an oath of loyalty, not to be communists and so forth. But what this actually does, it intensified the fears of a communist presence. And what the House Un-American Activities begins to do is it begins to essentially screw around with people that it didn't like, people that espoused different ideas from them. And in the typical manner of pots calling the kettle black, one of the members of the committee on the WAC was John Parnell Thomas, who was a very big red baiter, but he eventually would go to prison for 9 months, federal prison for 9 months for corruption. One of the most prominent institutions or organizations that came under the scope of the House Un-American Activities Committee was Hollywood. Hollywood was supposedly a den of iniquity for communists. Communists were raging all about. Some had actually professed membership in the Communist Party. A large number of others had gone to communist meetings and organized. Eventually, what happened between 1947 and 1957 is that the House Un-American Activities Committee ruined the lives and careers of a number of people, fueled by a Hollywood gossip columnist named Hedda Hopper, who was a former star herself, who is now a sort of like running the version of Entertainment Tonight on the newspapers. Hedda Hopper was a staunch Republican who viewed anybody that disagreed with her in any way as a communist and unpatriotic. Eventually, it was the Hollywood 10 who were a number of screenwriters, producers, and directors who were denied work in motion pictures because of their refusal to answer questions before the WAC. Many of them would go and they would admit very freely that they were A, communist, or B, had gone to communist meetings, but when they were asked to give up the names of other people, they said, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to do that. That's not why I'm here. And eventually they would start taking the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination. And so some of them went to prison. All of them were blacklisted. They were not allowed to be hired. The studio heads, Louis B. Mayer, and the United Artists, and the Warner Brothers, would shy away from hiring them because they did not want to be labeled as communists. And so 500 actors and writers and directors were blacklisted for a time. Eventually, though, Hollywood defied the list and rehired most of the actors. And it really started with Kirk Douglas, Michael Douglas's father, who basically told Hedda Hopper to go take a jump in the lake. He was going to hire the screenwriter for his movie Spartacus. Now, not all of the actors were on the side of the communists or those that were believed that they didn't have to testify and so forth. There were plenty of conservative actors. Ronald Reagan, for instance. John Wayne, the old Duke, was very much a flag-waving American, even though the Duke had not served in the military during World War II. The director, Elia Kazan, who directed On the Waterfront and A Streetcar Named Desire, named names. They approved of the blacklist. They even testified before the WAC. This is not to say that there were not enemies within America. There were communist subversives in the country. They were just looking in the wrong place for them half the time. In 1940, Congress passed and Roosevelt signed the Smith Act, which required all aliens to register. This begins to sound somewhat familiar to you, I would hope, given the current political state of things. This happens in June of 1940, as the country is but 18 months from war at this point. In 1950, Congress passes the McCarran Internal Security Act, and Truman signs it into law, that requires all communist organizations to register with the government. Where do they meet? What time? What facilities are they going to use? And so forth, so that federal agents could come and harass them, essentially. There was the Subversive Activities Control Board, which was a United States government committee to investigate communist infiltration of American society. Eventually, however, the Supreme Court, that was led by Earl Warren later on, essentially rendered the board powerless. But in the meantime, what they were doing was trying to see what teachers and what professions were being supposedly infiltrated by communists. And then there was Whittaker Chambers, who was born J. Vivian Chambers on April Fool's Day, 1901. He was an American editor who denounced his communist spying, and he became an intellectual leader of the American conservative movement after 1952. He defected from communism, then worked at Time magazine, and while he was under subpoena and testifying in 1948, he testified that there was a man in the State Department by the name of Alger Hiss, and Alger Hiss was a communist agent, and that Alger Hiss had perjured himself when he had gone before the House Un-American Activities Committee. Alger Hiss is then put on trial for being a Soviet agent, which means espionage. Now, he is not convicted of espionage, Alger Hiss. There's no proof of espionage, but there is proof of perjury, and so he's convicted of perjury. Why is this important? Number one, it gives evidence that something is going on in the government, that obviously the Soviets, the Russians, are fooling around with the government. Doesn't that sound familiar to you? It is also important because a young congressman from California now gets his opportunity to make a big stand. That congressman's name is Richard M. Nixon, who will now become one of the most notable conservative anti-communists in the U.S. government. And then there is the junior senator from Wisconsin, Joseph Raymond McCarthy, born in 1908, was known as Tail Gunner Joe because he inflated his war record. He was a tail gunner, but he did not see any combat. He was a U.S. Marine. Using that and capitalizing on the Catholic vote in the state of Wisconsin, he defeated Robert La Follette Jr. for the Senate in 1946, throwing out the great progressive tradition of Wisconsin in the process. McCarthy, for 4 years, is pretty much a non-entity in Congress until 1950, when he gets up and delivers a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia. While speaking to the Republican Women's Club on Lincoln Day, he produced a piece of paper that he claimed contained a list of known communists working for the State Department. He is usually quoted to have said, "The State Department is infested with communists. I have here in my hand a list of 205, a list of names that were made known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party and who nevertheless are still working and shaping policy in the State Department." With that, Joseph Raymond McCarthy became the #1 man in America as far as attention. There is some dispute about whether he said 205 or 57. Used the number 57 on occasions. He used the number 205 on other occasions. After a while, it was like, can we get the number right, please? Understand something. We had lost China in 1949. We had now surrendered the nuclear monopoly in 1949. There were a lot of people looking around, looking for a scapegoat, and Joseph McCarthy was more than happy to pounce upon this. McCarthy had a very rough reputation. He accused opponents and any who criticized him as being communists themselves or unpatriotic, and so McCarthyism becomes a byword for demagoguery. And demagoguery is any leader in a democracy who gains popularity by exploiting prejudice and ignorance among the common people, whipping up the passions of the crowd and shutting down any reasoned deliberation. They overturn established customs of political conduct, or they promise to threaten to do so. Wow, does that sound familiar to you, doesn't it? As a result of McCarthy's antics, he completely undermined the liberal cause, but he became a darling of the conservative movement, and he also became a darling of the Roman Catholic Church, which was avowedly anti-communist, to the point where there was an annual Joseph McCarthy Mass for a while. He destroyed Truman's hope for a third term. Not only that, He just basically disgusted Harry S. Truman so much, he wanted nothing more to do with government and wanted to get out. But in the end, Joseph Raymond McCarthy is undone by public backlash. Among the first to stand up to him was Millard Tydings, a representative and later a senator from the state of Maryland. He headed a committee that had his name on it, the Tydings Committee, to investigate McCarthy's claims of communist penetration of the government. In the end, he basically said, this is nothing, okay? And then he essentially begins the process of having McCarthy outed, which of course brings Tydings under the ire of McCarthy. It's during the Army McCarthy hearings that McCarthy is finally exposed as the bully and reprobate that he really is. Joseph Welch, the counsel for the Army, an elderly man whose credentials and patriotism were unquestionable, finally gets up and in the middle and says the following to McCarthy. There was a young man in Welch's law office named Fred Fisher who had belonged to the National Lawyers Guild, which many said was the legal mouthpiece of the Communist Party. Welch had discussed the matter with Fisher beforehand, and the two agreed that Fisher should not even show up at the hearings. But he said otherwise it was a youthful indiscretion. And he attacks McCarthy for naming the young man before a nationwide television audience without prior warning or previous agreement to do so. And this is what Welch says. Until this moment, Senator, I think I have never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness. Fred Fisher is a young man who went to the Harvard Law School and came into my firm and is starting what looks to be a brilliant career with us. Little did I dream you could be so reckless and so cruel as to do an injury to that lad. It is true he is still with Hale and Dorr. It is true that he will continue to be with Hale and Dorr. It is, I regret to say, equally true that I fear he shall always bear a scar needlessly inflicted by you. If it were in my power to forgive you for your reckless cruelty, I would do so. I like to think I am a gentleman, but your forgiveness will have to come from someone other than me. McCarthy goes back on the attack, and Welch interrupts him. Senator, may we not drop this? We know he belonged to the Lawyers Guild. Let us not assassinate this lad further. Senator, you've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you no sense of decency? And McCarthy tries to do it again, and Welch shuts him down and says, Mr. McCarthy, I will not discuss this further with you. You have sat within 6 feet of me and could have asked me about Fred Fisher. You have seen fit to bring it out, and if there is a God in heaven, it will do neither you nor your cause any good. I will not discuss it further. I will not ask Mr. Cohn any more witnesses. You, Mr. Chairman, may, if you will, call the next witness. And everybody in the Senate chamber broke into applause. It was over with for Joseph McCarthy in front of those people. He had been destroyed by a man that was 5 times his stature and character. Adding to this was the attacks by Edward R. Murrow, a CBS broadcaster, who on his program Up Front used it to attack McCarthy. McCarthy tried to attack him back, alleging all sorts of wild, insane rumors about Murrow, but Murrow stood firm. And eventually Murrow got cashiered out of CBS because of all this, but still, despite that, it got through. Eventually, Joseph McCarthy was censured by the Senate. Have you noticed that he only lived until 1957? He was 49 years old when he died. He was an atrocious drunk. He died of cirrhosis of the liver. So how did the Soviets get the bomb? As I said, some scientists gave it to them. For whatever reason, either they sympathized with the Soviets or they felt that morally the United States should not have a monopoly on nuclear weapons. Julius Rosenberg was the scientist. He was accused of passing atomic secrets to the Soviets. Ethel Rosenberg, his wife, we're not really sure what her role was. What we think is that she was simply guilty by association or by standing by her man in the time of trial. You may remember that when I was quoting Joseph Welch in the proceedings, I mentioned the name Cohn. Well, there he is, Roy Cohn, who was the legal advisor to McCarthy throughout this. Roy Cohn was part of the Justice Department prosecution of Alger Hiss. It is he who prosecuted the Rosenbergs, and despite public outcry, he managed to secure the death penalty for Ethel Rosenberg as well. Roy Cohn prosecuted homosexuals in the government. That was his particular bête noire in the government, is that he loved to go after homosexuals. He was a bulldog of an attorney, and he was a seriously warped human being. For you see, there is one thing that you should know about Roy Cohn, the prosecutor of homosexuals. He was homosexual himself. Eventually, he died of AIDS in the 1980s. But in 1971, he came across two up-and-coming members of Washington Legal Society and New York Society. One was Roger Stone, who became the campaign chair, essentially, for Donald Trump, and he came across Donald Trump, and he mentored and tutored young Trump in never admit to anything, always smear the opponent. Yes, there you are, looking at the man who essentially helped create what is going on today. On the right of this slide is Millard Tydings, senator from Maryland. On the left of this slide is Joseph Edward R. Murrow, who was a CBS reporter. Remember Edward R. Murrow? As he reported from London, essentially trying to force his way into. Let me give you some more of his reporting in regards to Senator Joseph McCarthy. Censure is the public party, immediate darling, inappropriate conduct. Once he went on